Let us imagine a promise that changed the course of history, a divine blessing given to Abraham, destined to transform his descendants into great nation. But did this promise, which was supposed to unite, end up becoming the starting point of a division that extended across siglos? What was the true meaning behind this blessing? In this video, we will delve deeper into the history of Isaac and Ishmael, explore maps and genealogies that reveal their lines, and decipher interpretations that form divergent beliefs and traditions. Do you want to understand how these biblical stories still affect the present and impact the current Middle East? So stay with us until the end and discover how Abraham's promise continues to resonate in the relationship between Jews and Arabs. As the time passed and the promise of a legitimate son continued unfulfilled, the restlessness began to take hold of Sarah's heart. Even though I deeply loved Abraham and trusted in the divine promise, I saw age advance and felt the pain of uncertainty. The burden of having children seemed increasingly daunting, and in an attempt to honor God's promise, Sarah made a proposal that would change the course of their lives and that of their descendants. Sarah suggested to Abraham that he had a child with Hagar, his Egyptian servant. This type of arrangement, although difficult to accept emotionally, was a common practice at the time. It was a complex decision, but Sarah believed that through Agar she could finally see the promise of a line come true. Then Agar became embarrassed and gave birth to Ismael, Abraham's first son. The birth of Ismael brought the patriarch immense joy. Finally, I have an heir, someone who could continue his descent, honoring the divine promise. But with the birth of Ismael, tensions arose between Sarah and Agar. The Egyptian servant, now the mother of Abraham's son, began to feel more valued, something that deeply bothered Sarah. Agar was also proud of what he represented: Ismael, the fulfillment of a divine promise and the extension of Abraham's lineage. Despite the difficulties, life continued its course until, unexpectedly, destiny met another surprise. God appeared again to Abraham and reaffirmed the promise, making it clear that this time Sarah would be the mother of a new heir. The shock was immense, and the news revealed to the light the complicated relationship between Ismael, the firstborn, and the future child that Sarah was about to conceive. This revelation would mark a new chapter in history, laying the foundations for a rivalry that would resonate across generations. When Isaac was born, it was as if God's promise finally came true in a full and miraculous way. Abraham and Sarah, who did not expect to live this experience, will find themselves in a unique position, blessed with a legitimate son. Isaac's birth brought immense joy to the family, but also generated a new kind of tension, especially for Ismael. Until then, he had been Abraham's only heir, and Isaac's arrival brought with him the feeling that his place in the family could be questioned. As the children grew, the difference between them became more visible. Even though they were brothers of blood, their lives took different directions. Ismael, seeing him firstborn, naturally believed that he would inherit the promised promises to his father, but the presence of Isaac began to change this perspective. The relationship between the brothers, despite their limited time together, developed a silent rivalry, reinforced by the differences in treatment and the feelings found that arose within their own home. Sarah, realizing the bond that Abraham had with Ishmael, became increasingly worried about Isaac's future. Fearing that Ishmael would dispute the divine inheritance with his son, he asked Abraham who had fired Hagar and Ishmael, separating them from the lineage once and for all. When I reacted, Abraham accepted, guided by God to send his eldest son along a new path. Thus, Ismael was guided on his own journey, from where he would give rise to a great nation, as God promised him. From that moment on, Isaac and Ishmael took separate paths, each carrying a part of Abraham's blessing, but also the weight of a conflict that had just begun to unfold. Please review and advise me so that I can continue with the next chapter. Abraham was a man of unbreakable faith. I had gone through many trials and challenges in my life, but along the way, I always maintained an unbreakable trust in God's promise. One day, a message changed his life forever. God promised an extraordinary inheritance. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars of the sky and would have a land of their own, a sacred home where they would call Canaan. For Abraham, this promise simply meant a blessing, a change in everything he knew, a great mission, something that his wife Sara had been waiting for a long time. In those times, the value of a man and his descendants was often measured by the number of children who died in the world. Sin hijos, Abraham faced great pain, and each day seemed more unlikely than it was, and Sara realized her fate of having inherited inheritances. But God's promise illuminated his heart, and this hope of a powerful line led Abraham to new strengths. God declared that this blessing came from his own descendants. But how could this happen if Sarah was advanced in age and the hope of having a child seemed unattainable? Abraham lived this duality, the certainty of the promise and the reality of his life, and the conflict between faith and doubt accompanied him daily. However, Abraham clung to what God had promised him, trusting that somehow God's word would prevail. He did not know that this promise also carried the weight of a future division, an election that would separate his children and influence the destinies of two great nations, with the separation of his brothers, Ismael and his mother, Agar, seated in one. Lejana region, known for its aridity and desolation. In this time, Ismael grew and formed his own family, and with time he would become the ancestor of a great lineage, as God had promised him to Abraham. This ancestry, known historically as an Arab pueblo, maintains the connection, spiritual relationship with Abraham through Ishmael, considering him as the legitimate heir of his blessings and divine purpose. Meanwhile, Isaac remained by Abraham's side, and as he grew older, he began to prepare for what he would inherit from his father. During his travels through the land of Canaan, Isaac learned about the holy pact between God and Abraham, listening to stories that carried the weight of the sacred promise. Unlike Ishmael, his lineage remained concentrated in Canaan, and through his descendants the sweet tribes of Israel emerged, a village chosen to preserve the divine laws and the special relationship with God. This scenario began to delimit distinct nations, each with its own culture, territory, and identity, but with a common ancestor, Abraham. Through maps and genealogies, it is possible to trace the roots of each pueblo and see how both began to extend across the region, each with their own vision of the world and the purpose they led. By understanding these lines, we begin to glimpse the complexity of the traditions and unique features that mark the journey of each descendant. This understanding helps to clarify the first steps of what, over time, would become a story of tensions and territorial claims, whose roots were deeply linked to the promise made to Abraham. The promise he made to Abraham ended up generating profoundly different interpretations between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael. In the heart of Jewish tradition, Isaac is seen as the son of the divine promise, chosen by God to give rise to a special nation that would maintain an eternal pact. This understanding is supported to a large extent by Jewish sacred texts, from which Isaac stands out as the legitimate heir, through which he spent the land of Canaan and spiritual blessing. On the other hand, in Islamic tradition, Ishmael is considered the firstborn and therefore the legitimate heir to the blessing of Abraham. According to the sacred texts of Islam, he is the son through which the divine promise was fulfilled, seen as a direct ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad and a great nation. For Muslims, Ismael symbolizes obedience and fidelity, qualities that Abraham and his eldest son demonstrated when facing the graves in the desert and building together the Kaaba in Mecca, one of the most sacred places in Islam. This difference in interpretation has deep roots in the religious traditions of each group, influencing not only their spirituality, but also their vision of the world and their place in history. Both Jews and Muslims developed strong narratives about the promise he made to Abraham, seeing themselves as guardians of a sacred inheritance. These perspectives, transmitted from generation to generation, help to solidify distinct identities that are still reflected today in the religious practices and beliefs of each group. This divergence of interpretations, however, was not just a question of faith, of identity and legitimacy. Throughout the siglos, these traditions continued to grow in parallel, each with the conviction of being the legitimate heir to the promise of Abraham. And it was precisely this conviction, based on siglos de enseñanzas, that would transform the initial promise into a point of lasting tension. Abraham's promise, which was supposed to be a symbol of blessing and prosperity, also became one of the roots of intense disputes. Along the siglos, the lines of Isaac and Ismael developed their own cultures, religions, and traditions, each one becoming stronger in their convictions and territories. The land of Canaan, which Abraham had traveled with the promise that it would be an eternal home for his descendants, became the center of complaints and conflicts between this town, which saw in that land the fulfillment of a sacred promise. Over time, history has been marked by a series of confrontations that involved territorial occupation, especially in the Middle East regions. Both Jews and Arabs developed historical narratives that reinforced their right to these lands, based on their ancestral connections with Abraham and their religious traditions. These historical conflicts, many of which still form today's politics and international relations, are not limited to disputes over land. The fight for identity, reconnaissance, and survival has become an integral part of the trajectory of this pueblo, which continues to come to Abraham as a central figure. The promise that sometimes symbolized hope and continuity ended up intertwining with complex geopolitical relationships, symbolizing a historical bond that unites and divides. When reflecting on Abraham's promise and the complex relationships between Jews and Arabs, it is crucial to let us know that history is much more than past events. It is a fertile field for us to learn about identity, belonging, and the need for reconciliation. The division that began with a blessing became one of the greatest conflicts in the history of humanity, showing how different interpretations of a single promise could have devastating consequences. Today, in light of the story of Isaac and Ismael, we are invited to seek understanding and dialogue instead of perpetuating cycles of rivalry. The promise of a better future for both communities can come true, but it requires courage and the willingness to look to the past, recognize mistakes, and build a common path. Therefore, the message that emerges in the story of Abraham is clear. Unity and peace are possible, always when we are willing to listen and learn from others. It seems that the story ends with the last chapter, but I am going to expand the final narrative, including a more solid conclusion to summarize the theme in an impactful way. Let's do it. When reflecting on Abraham's promise and the complex relationships between Jews and Arabs, it is crucial to let us know that history is much more than past events. It is a fertile field for us to learn about identity, belonging, and the need for reconciliation. The division that began with a blessing became one of the greatest conflicts in the history of humanity, showing how different interpretations of a single promise could have devastating consequences. The legacy of Abraham, which was supposed to symbolize hope and unity, became a mirror of the complexities of human relationships. What began as a divine call became part of lasting rivalries, where each side claimed the authenticity of its traditions. This struggle, both spiritual and territorial, reminds us of the fragility of peace and the importance of dialogue. Today, in light of the story of Isaac and Ismael, we are invited to seek understanding and dialogue instead of perpetuating cycles of rivalry. The promise of a better future for both communities can come true, but it requires courage and the willingness to look to the past, recognize mistakes, and build a common path. The true essence of the promise lies in the possibility of a peaceful coexistence, where both communities can honor their heritage without undermining the other. The lessons that emerge from this ancient history are more relevant than ever. In a world where conflicts continue to wreak havoc, the message that resonates in the story of Abraham is clear. Unity and peace are always possible, always when we are willing to listen and learn from others. Abraham's legacy should not be divisive, but rather an invitation to reflect on how we can, together, write a new chapter in history that celebrates diversity and harmony among all.